So after 7 hours, we are ready for the main event of this conference, which is our second keynote, which is going to be given by Chris Giancarlo. Now, Chris Giancarlo is probably best known as a recent chair of the CFTC, which is the government agency that regulates crypto derivatives. But I think that's a little bit underselling his significance to the people in the room and other people interested in crypto. Because while the CFTC is the regulatory agency for crypto derivatives, of course, it wasn't always regulating crypto derivatives. And in particular, when he started, it wasn't regulating crypto derivatives. But early in his tenure as the chair, the CBOE and the CME moved towards self-certification of Bitcoin futures trading, of course. And there were plenty of people in the private sector and the public sector that would have liked to have seen the CFTC block that process and step in the way of it. But our speaker today, who was in charge at the time, decided that wasn't the appropriate approach. And instead, he put together a team at the CFTC to try to ensure that Bitcoin futures trading would come off as successfully and as safely as possible. And of course, now we have other crypto derivatives also under the purview of the CFTC. And it's, I think, worth noting that sort of for that very foundational role he played in the crypto revolution, he has been dubbed by the Twitter sphere as a crypto dad. And so without any further ado, Chris, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I must say that when I received the invitation to speak to you today, I was a little taken back and maybe even a little bit nervous about presenting to a group of esteemed and very productive economists. I'm a lawyer myself and eventually made my way into Washington public policy debates. And, lawyers and regulators, I think, always have had a little bit of a tense relationship with economists. When I arrived at the CFTC, I wanted to meet the office of the chief economist. And I asked where it was, and I wound up going down some stairs and up some stairs in a back hall, and eventually found where the office was. And it was sort of indicative of that relationship. And I've often wondered why that is. And I have to be honest, I think it's because policymakers and lawyers would rather not have the facts get in the way of a good story. Which is often how they may see the role of your discipline. So when I received this invitation today, I thought about, well, why would you want me to come and present? And I thought, well, maybe you want a good story to sort of leaven up a little bit the facts that you've been dealing with for the last 24 hours. So thank you for having me here. And if I can maybe give you a good story, what I'd like to do actually is present to you a set of remarks that I recently gave at a private dinner in Washington that was convened by Senator Pat Toomey. And remarkably, and we think about Washington as, battles from behind entrenched lines, but in fact, it was a dinner for 10 Republican and 10 Democrat senators in a private restaurant in Washington to talk about crypto. And I was there along with Michael Casey, who's a well-written author on this, to speak to these senators, all of whom, put themselves forth as wanting to have greater expertise in the area. And so Michael and I both presented at this dinner, which was terrific, and it was engaged in great conversation. And it belies the notion that that there are not some things that both parties in Washington can't sit down and really converse about. And in the area of crypto, I'm actually quite optimistic that we may see some smart thinking from Congress. And as I'll say in my remarks, I really hope that's the case. So what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about, I'd like to present to you the overview of crypto, the concepts that I tried to impart with these policymakers of how to think about this thing we call crypto. And then I'll end with the policy prescriptions that I put in front of them that I'm hopeful might see their way through. So you forgive me, I'm going to read a bit, but I'm also from time to time going to speak to you directly. So there are many today, including maybe a few in this audience, although I probably doubt it, who believe that crypto is just some funky new tradable asset class that may or may not stand the test of time. Indeed, some of that belief may be being reinforced by what we're seeing in the markets in the last few days. I get that. 6 or 7 years ago, I used to wonder about that myself. But let me suggest to you that this topic we broadly call crypto is something much more. And I suggest that crypto is nothing less than a new architecture of value, an entirely new way of confirming the ownership and transfer of things of value, including that most precious thing of value, money itself. And I further suggest that current market conditions, just like the dot-com crash, market crash of 2000, which I lived through, will do nothing to change the overall trajectory of this revolutionary change in the architecture of money and finance. And as Fahad mentioned, I've just written a book entitled Crypto Dad, The Fight for the Future of Money. And it's the story of my 4 decades in the intersection of law, markets, and technology. First 16 years as a New York and London lawyer, then 14 years building a successful trade execution firm on Wall Street that we were able to take public onto the New York Stock Exchange. And then 5 years as a senior markets regulator in Washington, and today as a corporate director, business investor, and book author. A decade and a half ago, the firm I launched on Wall Street became the world's leading trading platform for the multi-trillion-dollar market for credit default swaps, only to find itself in the epicenter of the 2008 financial crisis. And that experience led me to support reform of global financial markets, including the Dodd-Frank Act, a law that I now view as the last major patch of the longstanding analog account-based financial system. And those experiences resulted in my appointment to one of the world's least understood, yet perhaps most important financial market regulators in the world. And that's the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC. And I was first appointed by President Barack Obama and unanimously confirmed by the US Senate. And I was subsequently elevated to the role of chairman by President Trump, and quite remarkably, and to my surprise, unanimously confirmed by the Senate a second time. Which proves that I either, nobody knew what the CFTC did in the Senate, or I hadn't annoyed too many of them, enough of them to stop me in my second time around. And I went to Washington in 2014 as a political amateur, but with reformist goals. And my immediate objective was to complete and improve reforms to the over-the-counter derivative markets. Yet halfway through my term, I was staring at the first ripples of the next wave of the internet of value, of Bitcoin and of cryptocurrencies, a wave that I believe now will shake the existing financial system to its roots. The immediate challenge in 2017, as Fahad mentioned, was a new futures market product called Bitcoin futures. And as I explained in my book, I faced significant pressure here and abroad to prevent Bitcoin futures from being launched. But I resisted the pressure, and not without a few moments of self-doubt. Instead, I led the agency to create the world's first significant regulated market for cryptocurrency. And the decision paved the way for the emergence of an enormous new ecosystem of retail and institutional cryptocurrency, greater than anything we could have anticipated back in 2017. The point is, by braving political risk, the CFTC actually reduced regulatory uncertainty and risk for financial market innovators. And at the time, I also recognized the growing generational divide in attitudes toward crypto, a divide that exists today. For that reason, the online cryptocurrency community dubbed me Crypto Dad, which I've used as the title for my book. So what I want to do is tell you where I think we are in this crypto evolution. Now let's start with our legacy financial system. If money makes the world go round, the legacy financial system is the engine, the drivetrain, the gearbox, and the suspension that drives it. And US dollars are the preferred fuel. And an increasingly consolidating group of gigantic US banks are the racing teams that dominate the global action. The legacy system is massive, it's powerful, and it's deeply ingrained in the global economy, and it's deeply ingrained in Washington politics. It's operated by a host of intermediaries and functionaries and service providers the world around, all of whom ensure the allocation of global capital and availability of financial resources. The core technology of this system is account-based, and recorded on proprietarily owned centralized ledgers. Critical data, such as information about who holds, transfers, and receives things of value, including money, is recorded and managed as assets and liabilities by central intermediaries, such as banks and asset managers, insurance companies, and clearinghouses. Your 401k statement is not a receipt for actual stacks of dollar bills owned by you placed in some vault somewhere. It's a confirmation of a commercial liability to you by that 401k provider. And it's a liability that is unique to that commercial institution and unlikely to be fully backstopped by insurance or a sovereign government. Now, the system that we have today is broadly effective, though it's not readily transparent or automatically confirmable by participants in the system. Effective confirmation of your ownership of value comes through the indirect means of third-party auditing accountancy. For decades, this legacy system has worked, and it's generally served well. It has fueled the US economy, the largest, most diverse, most creative economy the world has ever seen. And the system is the basis for millions of jobs and careers, from Wall Street bankers and traders to lawyers and accountants, to central bankers, academics, and regulators. Let's be honest, the system has put a lot of food on a lot of tables, including my own. Yet at the same time, the shortcomings of this legacy financial system are increasingly becoming apparent. The system is slow and the system is expensive. And that's so because of the built-in cost and time of centrally verifying the world's account activity and collecting activity data from so many entities. Existing account-based systems for check payment and settlement, shareholder and proxy voting, investor access and disclosure, and even the financial system regulatory framework that were once state-of-the-art and global models in the 20th century have indeed fallen behind the times in the 21st century. In some cases, it's embarrassing. For example, it typically takes days in the US to settle and clear retail bank transfers. In other countries, it takes mere minutes. And it also takes days to settle securities transactions. And it's ridiculously expensive to remit money overseas. It's often faster. If you need to get money from here to Paris, it would be easier to stuff it in a suitcase and get it on an airplane than it would to do it a wire transfer. And nothing better reveals the limits of our existing financial system than the US government's initial financial response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Tens of millions of Americans had to wait a month or more to receive relief payments by paper check. And more than 1 million payments were made to people who were dead. And worse than slow and expensive and inefficient is that the existing system is exclusive, and it's exclusive by design. And it's exclusive by design because it's identity-based to prevent tax evasion and illegal conduct. Without credentialed identity, you cannot access the current financial system. Yet in a world of over 8 billion people, over 1 billion do not have credentialed identity sufficient to obtain financial services. And here in the United States, the system is only somewhat better. Thus, it's the very architecture of the legacy bank liability system itself and the concentrated power of its central players with their proprietary account ledgers that makes our existing system architecturally slow, expensive, and worse, exclusive. Meanwhile, as this legacy centralized financial system has evolved from the 20th century to the 21st without a lot of change, most other forms of human commerce have gone through profound change. Digital transformation made possible by the mid-20th century's arguably most important hardware innovation, the semiconductor. That led to the production of inexpensive microprocessors that stimulated the personal computer revolution, putting enormous data and analysis on the desktops of people and businesses around the world. Yet as important as that hardware breakthrough was, perhaps more important came in the area of software. Global agreement on a key set of internet protocols especially a protocol known as TCP/IP, enabled the world's billions of personal computers to be networked into a giant supercomputer, what we refer to as the internet, a global system of interconnected networks of devices, more powerful and unassailable than any single mainframe computer. And of standardized protocols for communications among the world's computers gave birth to the first internet wave of the late 20th century, a wave that we might consider an internet of information. That internet wave of information has transformed so many human activities, from music, think Pandora and Spotify, to retail shopping, Amazon and eBay, local transportation, Uber and Lyft, photography, Flickr and TikTok, and of course, social networking, Facebook and LinkedIn, and communications, Twitter and FaceTime. That first internet wave was superseded by a second wave. As those microprocessors got smaller and smaller and put in devices, we came to the Internet of Things, in which most every place we shop and dwell, everything we wear and drive, and every device we engage is connected to the Internet. And once again, the catalyst for that second wave was development of software. That is 5G and Bluetooth and Wi-Fi technology that allowed those devices to talk in a wireless way. Well, we're now going into the third wave, an internet of value. And this wave is exploring use, once again, of that worldwide network of computers and devices to use them for, rather than proprietary commercial and central bank infrastructure, but to govern our relationship with things of value. It holds the promise that all things of value, whether they're energy, agricultural, and mineral commodities, contracts, stock certificates, land records, property titles, cultural assets like music and art, as we've been talking about, and personal assets like votes in an election, even personal identities, can be stored, managed, transacted, and moved around in a secure, private way directly from person to person without dependence on opaque central intermediaries. You might call the idea bookkeeping without bookkeepers, or at least without centralized bookkeepers. Instead, it's about using the computational power of the world's billions of computers to talk to each other and provide algorithmic certainty of ownership of things of value, rather than relying on the balance sheets of large financial institutions, accountants, and central banks. Here's a simple way to think about it. When I was a college student traveling in Europe, it was expensive to call home to my parents. Those phone calls had to travel over the proprietary phone lines operated by British Telecom and the Bell system that charge handsomely for access. Today, however, my son, a grad student in the UK, can call me anytime, day or night, at virtually no cost. Why? Because he uses FaceTime, the internet. He's not on a proprietary line, he's using that giant network of computers. And I can send him a photo or a music file instantaneously at no cost. Why? Because once again, I'm bypassing proprietary phone lines and communications, instead using agreed algorithms through the internet. Well, if we can use the internet rather than the proprietary ledgers of banks, 401k providers, and clearinghouses to confirm who owes what and who transferred what to whom, why can't I send my son money just as simply as I can call him day or night? Of course, as with the proprietary internet waves, all that was needed, or all that is needed, is agreement on internet protocols. It's the software breakthrough that matters once again. Well, that breakthrough came. It came in 2009 with the white paper of Satoshi Nakamoto. It proposed using the decentralized network of the world's unrelated computers to reliably reach agreement with each other on the question of what? Question of who owns what and who transferred what to whom. Like TCP/IP, like Bluetooth, like what the Bitcoin blockchain is a protocol for the Internet of Value. And it's a protocol that now is competing for patronage with other protocols, like Ethereum, like Solana, like Avalanche, each with different features, attributes, and shortcomings. So when you think about crypto, think about the underlying distributed ledger protocols as the basis for the inherent value of their tokens. The ledgers are what's vying for a role in this new Internet of value. When you think about the individual tokens, think about the rights they convey to play a role in the development of those protocols and the government of the development of their rules. Market demand and hence price of individual tokens is affected by the perception of the possible role those protocols will play in the future. And just as the Internet of Information is a network of networks using different protocols with different features and properties, so too the future Internet of Value is likely to be one of numerous protocols. Frankly, it's naive to think that this wave of the Internet will not transform banking, financial services, and money itself in the same way that earlier waves of the Internet transformed information, social interaction, retail shopping, transportation, photography, music, and so much else. It's going to happen. It's already happening. Money is changing right before our eyes. Like text messages and photographs, money is becoming digital, decentralized, tokenized, borderless, timeless, and ultimately will transcend time itself. Value is now transferable around the world in nanoseconds, 365, 24 hours a day, in a way that's increasingly decoupled from the traditional bank account-based system and correspondent banking services. And it shows no signs of abating, with crypto developer activity reaching an all-time high in 2021. And that's what I say, that what is happening today is much, much bigger than some faddish new asset class called crypto. It's a totally new Internet-based architecture of finance and money itself. And the social, economic, and geopolitical impacts of this new innovation are inestimable, and yet they are seismic. So here's where I put my former regulator's hat back on and ask, what should be the public policy response to the rise of crypto? Well, if we look for precedent, we can go back a quarter century ago and see how the first wave of the Internet of Information, was greeted in Washington, and it was done so in a timely, enlightened, and most importantly, bipartisan manner. A Democratic White House and a Republican Congress came together in the 1990s to promote development of online commerce and the so-called information superhighway, unfettered by inapt federal and state law. This wise policy response adopted the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm. And the results are remarkable. Only in time will we be able to appreciate the critical role that 1990s Washington policy response had in furthering the extraordinary societal impact of the democratization of global access to information wrought by the first wave of the Internet. So where are we today? Well, in our current era, Washington's official policy response to the Internet of Value has largely been ad hoc and uncoordinated. Government largely stood aside during the past decade and a half since the Satoshi white paper. But that is changing, however. The Biden administration recently published an executive order on cryptocurrencies that is reasonably balanced, comprehensive, and somewhat forward-leaning. The executive order takes a careful view of private sector innovations in money, such as Bitcoin and so-called stablecoins. And it instructs the US government agencies to increase their understanding, consider new regulatory standards, and coordinate their efforts. As with all new technologies, including the first wave of the Internet, there are honest concerns about use of cryptocurrency in illicit activities, fraud and manipulation, and schemes that trap the unwary. There are also legitimate concerns particular to crypto innovation, such as the environmental impact of proof-of-work blockchains relying on mining. There are also systemic concerns about financial runs and other disruption to the existing framework of financial intermediation, lending, and payments, and the manner in which they are overseen and regulated. And some critics see digital assets as a threat to intermediated, centralized finance. Yet there is undoubtedly a generational divide between operators of the legacy financial system and the pioneers of this internet of value. It's something that I write about in my book. I call it an institutional trust gap. Legacy financial system operators tend to be older, like me. We became comfortable with branch banking in our teens with the deposit of our first paychecks from summer or after school jobs. We've spent a lifetime immersed in the existing account-based financial system, and we don't readily envision alternatives. Yet today, most kids form institutional relationships with mobile phone providers, video game and social media platforms, and online retailers well before the age of 14, and well before they've set foot in a branch bank. They've operated in a 24/7, 365 peer-to-peer world all their lives. Convincing young people that Bitcoin and crypto is dangerous, while traditional banking is fun and safe, it's about as effective as telling them how important it is to learn to drive a manual shift car, if they have any interest in driving at all. The fact of the matter is that crypto has attracted more of their interest and excitement than Wall Street has enjoyed in a generation. For young people, digital technology is an essential agent of social change and expression. And this characteristic needs to be taken into account and respected in any crypto policy response from Washington. The question is how to craft public policy that brings together these two worlds, the legacy financial system and this new architecture of internet-based decentralized trust. Well, I think we need to start with congressional action. In democratic systems like the US, it's for the legislative branch to gather public opinion, sort through various and sometimes conflicting policy objectives, and arrive at overall national policy. And I also believe that such national policy must be established on a bipartisan basis. Crypto policy should not be one party's singular accomplishment or another party's wedge issue. To ensure that any resulting legislation enjoys wide and long-lasting political legitimacy, it must be accomplished with broad bipartisan support. Both parties must have a stake in the outcome. And there must be ample opportunity for substantive public input through congressional hearings and legislative review and comment. This is especially important as the ethos of the emerging crypto industry is individualist, egalitarian, and not naturally deferential to venerable regulatory frameworks. Legislation and regulation that suggests a top-down approach will not gain the respect of the internet generation. Congressional action and subsequent regulation must garner industry and societal skin in the game through active industry dialogue and engagement. Moreover, Washington's crypto policy response cannot be a defensive program to preserve the status quo. It must recognize a national interest in fostering healthy development of crypto innovation, well-ordered crypto trading markets, and their contribution to the modernization of the existing financial system. And further, national policy should seek to realize crypto's potential for greater financial inclusion than has been achieved by the legacy walled garden, identity-first financial system. Congress must establish a legal framework that allows ordinary and non-wealthy citizens to engage in digital asset investment and risk exposure in an informed and self-directed manner. Finally, national crypto policy must be comprehensive, balanced, and tailored to the unique features of this emerging technology. To do that, Congress must be willing to reconsider the current taxonomy of regulation that divides US financial markets into those for capital formation, which is what the SEC does, and those for commodity pricing and risk transfer, which is what the CFTC does. The fact of the matter is that sometimes crypto can be used for purposes of capital formation, justifying an important role for the SEC. But on the other hand, more than half of cryptocurrency, consisting of Bitcoin and Ethereum, is not used for financing, but operates like a commodity subject to CFTC jurisdiction. In fact, while crypto can be used for both of these purposes, what it truly is, as I explained earlier, is a series of internet protocols for the validation of ownership and transfer of value. In that light, crypto has no natural home under existing legal and regulatory frameworks. What is needed is new thinking, but not necessarily a new federal regulatory agency. The fact is that the current security commodity taxonomy was crafted and its jurisprudence was developed in the physical analog world of the early 20th century. It originated at a time when tradable instruments could easily be divided into futures on commodities that came out of the ground and securities representing stakes in commercial enterprises. This taxonomy struggles to be relevant in the 21st century, with a broad notion of crypto refers to a diverse and complex collection of utility tokens, payment tokens, stable coins, NFTs, and the like. Applying legacy securities and commodities jurisprudence to such assets results in a patchwork of very different and sometimes conflicting substantive laws and compliance obligations that collectively act to impede innovation without conferring corresponding consumer protections. So Congress must address these issues by revisiting the specific application of its securities and commodities laws to crypto. So let me close now with a final thought. The standards, protocols, and rules for the digital future of value and the future of money itself are being established today. If we act and act now and act as a free society, we can make sure that democratic values like freedom of speech, rule of law, individual privacy, economic liberty are encoded in the digital future of value and the future of money. And in so doing, we can harness this wave of innovation to maximize financial inclusion, capital and operational efficiency, and economic growth for generations to come. And I'm convinced that money and things of value, the way they're recorded, the recording of who owns what, who transfers what to whom, is changing right before our eyes. And we must take hold of that change. Money itself is as much a social construct as it's a government one. And democratic societies must assert their voice in the digital future of money. We each have a role to play, and I thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I look forward to taking your questions.
So thank you, Chris, and I really enjoyed particularly the last part that you mentioned. And I wonder if I can pick your brain on something, maybe a bigger question. So I think one of the things that helped a great deal in the proliferation of the first internet, if you want, is the attitude of the United States towards speech, which is essentially hold, and anything can be done, anything can be said, and you know this is the foundation of the internet, is the exchange of information. Now the internet of value is somehow different, and there's sort of like especially I think over the last 20 years, we have developed a very different view of who is allowed to own what. So let me put this differently. So in principle, anybody can say anything, but sort of not everybody can own anything. And I think the biggest obstacle to, also from the political thinking and from the regulatory thinking towards, you know, the proliferation of a internet of value is actually this view, which is now deeply ingrained of we have to control who owns what, we have to know at every point in time who owns what. I'm wondering if this is not the starting point. So bigger picture here is this, is anti-money laundering, regulation, and KYC was not always a thing. And it's something which is relatively recent. I think, as I understand it, it comes from the first laws went on to gambling, which you know, it's not illegal in many countries in the world, but it is in the US, and that led to Visa not being able to use payments or not process payments for online gambling and so on. And so that kind of created a snowball effect, which now essentially hampers any institution to operate in a world where value can be exchanged freely and across borders. So maybe I'm wondering if this is maybe not a better starting point, instead of thinking about all the nitty-gritty pieces of, okay, so we have securities here and commodities there, is you have to start with anybody can own anything. If you're a criminal, we can take the money from you, but in principle, we can transfer money to a criminal. We can just take it later. That's what you have an FBI.
Yeah, it's such an important question, and we can spend hours on it. Let me just take a stab at it. One of the attractions of crypto is its ability to, I think, accelerate the movement from what's called Web 2 to Web 3, right? In Web 2, the Web 1, we saw the internet as an opportunity to have much more direct peer-to-peer relationships, direct relationships with information. Unfortunately, one of the things that developed was this: intermediaries once again came back on the scene for information, and we find in Web 2 that private institutions not governed by the First Amendment actually can control information. And so the hope is that as we move from Web 2 to Web 3, we regain that notion of independence on the web, certainly independence and freedom of speech, not governed. As we think about that Internet of Value, the hope is that as we move from a world of intermediaries, we move into a world of freedom. But one of the concerns is we replace big tech and its ability to censor our speech with big government and its ability to censor our economic activities. And we have constitutional rights in the United States to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of worship. But in a capitalist economy, what are those rights other than economic rights? The ability to contribute to causes we believe in, to contribute to faiths we believe in, to associate with people, freedom of assembly, associate with people we believe in. And yet if those transactions can be monitored and censored, then we don't have those constitutional rights. And it's similar in Europe, differently granted rights, but the same thing. So as we think about the Internet of Value, we do need to think about who are going to be the purveyors of systems of money. And it's something I spent a lot of time thinking with our focus on central bank digital currency at the Digital Dollar Project. There are some who reflexively say, we don't want government involved in the money of the future because their ability to monitor and censor. And my response is, think that more thoroughly, because we took the same position with the town square and we handed over our First Amendment rights to private actors who are not subject to the First Amendment. Government is subject to the First Amendment. The private sector is doing things that speech and government can't do. The government's also subject to the Fourth Amendment, right to privacy. And so when it comes to money, in a funny kind of way, and I write about this in my book, if the jurisprudence were to develop properly, central bank digital currency of a democracy may actually give you more rights than money promulgated by big tech, which may be under pressure to do things to censor financial transactions that government couldn't censor. So depending on left or right-wing government, you could find pressure on private operators of stablecoins not to process contributions to Planned Parenthood or Right to Life, depending on what side of the aisle one's on. So this is very challenging. I've enjoyed 4 decades in public life, and I've now dedicated what remains of my public life to speaking to people in free society, saying this Internet of Value is so powerful that if in free societies, public citizens are not out there making clear what will be acceptable, what not, we could find the freedoms we take for granted gone in an instant, because money is your ability to express your freedom. And if it's controlled by either private sector actors or government actors that will not hesitate to first surveil and then censor. And you may say, oh, there's Giancarlo getting a little crazy. Look, the digital yuan is now in the hands of 100 million Chinese, the ECNY. It is now the benchmark for central bank digital currency. And it's a surveillance tool, and it's a control tool. You criticize the regime, your ECNY will be disabled from getting a train out of your village, or worse. And that is not just going to stop at 100 million Chinese. It's not going to just be used for domestic use. It's going to be exported. The PBOC will make central bank CBDC in a box for regimes around the world that want the same surveillance and control over their citizens that the PBOC will have. And there are many states around the world that would like that control. Think Venezuela, think Cuba. And maybe even they don't want that control, but they're already subject to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and their client states, and they have no alternative but to use it. We could see within 10 years, a third of the globe operating under a central bank digital currency that I would call a surveillance and control coin. And so do you think the West is going to stand by and not come up with their own central bank digital currency once they've lost sanction power over the rest of the world? Of course it will happen. 9 out of 10 central banks around the world today are looking at central bank digital currency, and over 50% of them are involved in active exploration. Central bank digital currency, digital money. Now, it could be a blend between private currency and government currency, but some form of digital currency is the future. The real issue is not whether it's done by the sovereign or done by the private sector. The real question is, what are the values encoded in that digital money of the future? And are they the democratic values, economic liberty, financial privacy that we need to insist upon as a free society? And to me, I'm at the end of my career. You people younger in your career, you need to be out there insisting that whoever deploy, we cannot allow to happen to money what we allowed to happen to speech, and that somehow we're relaxed about. We must stand up and insist that the digital money of the future protects our privacy and is uncensorable, obviously for legal transactions. And we can talk more about that, but I don't want to dominate entirely with this one question. Thank you.
I want maybe to follow up on what you almost said. Like you brought up these CBDCs with focus on China. So my question is really to follow. I think there's some debate whether with the launch of ECNY and this other internationalization effort, do you think there's some potential challenge for the US dollar dominance? And second, essentially, you have also these private cryptocurrencies. Do you think if you have lots of these stablecoins denominated in US dollar, do you see some benefits of that? Because that's essentially exporting the US dollar probably to other parts of the world.
Well, so here's what's interesting, right? We talk about privacy, right? So China set a model that's there. That's now a benchmark, right? I think you're going to see some China-like models rolled out, okay, that are not as surveillable. Even the Fed talks about protecting consumer privacy. So the argument we made, well, we're not as bad as China. I think that's the wrong approach. The right approach, and if we want the dollar to remain the world gold standard, the right approach is to create Liberty Coin and to make a design feature that your liberty, your privacy is protected. Right from the beginning, create something and say you have absolute privacy for lawful transactions. And I'll get to how to do it in a minute. If we do that, we'll create an instrument, whether it's created by the government, created by the private sector, created by Europe. If we get privacy right, aspiration around the people around the world will aspire to use that instrument. So privacy is both a potential weakness, but it's also a tremendous strength if we were to get it right. And so my advocacy for it is, even if you're not a big fan of, constitutional liberties, if you just want a strong dollar, the best way to make the dollar the world's strongest currency, or the euro, or any country smart enough to do it, is to guarantee privacy. Now, how do we do that? The problem we have today, I think the biggest barrier we have today to the Internet of Value is an ongoing confusion between our current methodology of what's called AML KYC, anti-money laundering, know your customer, and the objectives, the laudable objectives of protecting money laundering, tax evasion, illicit conduct, and money. The current methodology is actually not very good. We know that. In the federal government, we know that the false positive rate for reports of potential violations of AML KYC is over 95%. It costs more to operate the system than we actually catch in illicit behavior. And why is that? Because the system operates on an identity-first basis. Basically, we've put a wall around financial services in the world and say, if you want to access it, you need credentialed identity. Well, as I said in my remarks, in a world of over 8 billion people, over 1.5 billion don't have sufficient credentialed identity to access financial services. But somehow we're okay with that because I hate to say it, government likes collecting all that identity that you've got to get into the system. And basically it says, we want your identity in case you do something wrong. Now that's one form of law enforcement. But there are other forms of law enforcement that we use every day that don't operate on we need your identity in case you do something wrong. The best example is highway law enforcement. We freely get on the freeway. We don't stop at a toll booth and say, here's my social security number, here's where I live, here's where I bank, here's how much money I've got in the bank. No, you get on the highway, and what does law enforcement do? It uses pattern recognition to determine whether there's probable cause of a commission of a crime. What do I mean by pattern recognition? If you're speeding, if you're involved in reckless driving, if you've got broken taillights, these are reasons for the police to look further, in some cases pull you over, and in some cases get your identity, and and go down that rabbit hole of who you are. But we first allow you to engage in commerce. Well, imagine a system that instead of collecting all this upfront identity, use the very tools that the blockchain and big data provides us, the same tools that Amazon is using every day, eBay is using every day, Facebook is using every day. That is big data analysis, pattern recognition. We started doing some of that at the CFTC, and you know what? We got some great results. Regulators and policymakers and governments can use looking at patterns of commercial usage to identify patterns that disclose the probable cause of crime commission. We could let so many more people into our system without collecting all that upfront data. If we move from the current reactionary, we need to know who you are before we let you in, to let's let more people in. Now, there's a lot of sophistication. There could be tiers. You know, if you're an individual and you're doing a few $1,000s in transactions, let's let people in. If you're a large institution, maybe some of that upfront data collection is appropriate. But it starts with, we need to stop confusing the current methodology of AMO. And now, Andreas asked, how did we get here? Well, we got here through a combination of the inherent architecture of the current system. The banknote system means that every transaction, we need to identify the parties to the transaction, because we need to identify what bank account is being debited and what bank account is being credited. But if we create a digital currency system that's more like digital fiat, all we need to have is the right algorithm to confirm that the transfer is proper on the blockchain. We don't necessarily need to know who owns the wallets at either side. And so we can do it. This technology gives us the ability to create tokenized money in the form of a digital bearer instrument. And we don't need all that upfront information. The real task is going to get to policymakers that, quite frankly, like gathering all that information to move away. And I think what we need to do is say to them, we need to put in front of their face that you're excluding a lot of peoples in the world with this current system. Is it really justified as we've got the new technology? We can do this.
Is it feasible under the current climate to get there?
Look, I'll tell you one thing about technology I know. You can't stop it. This technology is coming. And you know what? Life's a conveyor belt. The septuagenarian leadership that we have in Washington and Europe is eventually going to exit the stage, and younger people are coming along. Younger people that have grown up trading tokens on video games, operating a 360 world, are going to dominate the stage. So this is coming. These changes are there. We're in a particularly, I think, resistant period right now, but that will end.
There's a couple of quick questions.
Yeah.
One, do you have any plans on running for president? Second, that CBDC that you're talking about, do you advocate for that on a public blockchain or something more private?
So I grapple with this in my book, and where I come out is the best guarantor of individual liberty may be a combination between central bank digital money that is properly guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment and private sector money. In the same way that for a search engine today, I use DuckDuckGo, and I'm not a shill for the company. I like the fact that they got my business because they said they're not going to steal my information. I'd love a world where I have a choice of what payment rails to use based upon how my information is used. It may be that I'm a musician, I like to buy instruments. If I'm going to buy a guitar, I'll use the one that actually monitors it because they're going to give me a discount the next time I buy a guitar. But if I want to give to a controversial cause, in a strange way, I actually may use a digital dollar if the federal government is guaranteed to me that they're bound by the First Amendment and they're not going to gather my information. So I think the best result may be choice. And that allows a free society to say, enough of you taking my information, I'm going to go for my lawful transactions with this platform or that platform. And please. This fellow's had his hand up. I'll come back to you, Professor. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so just, would you mind talking a little bit more about your digital dollar project?
Sure.
And specifically, I'm also interested in, like, what do you see the potential interaction of the digital dollar project with this emerging DeFi ecosystem?
Right. So when I left the government in the summer of 2019, I really started with concern. So a little background. So one of the tectonic plates that was moving during my 5 years at the CFTC was attempts to replicate some of the core commodity trading markets and pricing markets by China. One of the strengths of the dollar, so I'll put my cards on the table. I actually believe that the last 30-year period of globalization that has brought more than 1 billion people out of poverty has been not just a coincidence of the rise of the dollar, but a consequence of it. I think that for the most part, and it's not an uncheckered history, but for the most part, the dollar has been an aspirational currency of people who have sought to engage in global commerce, to better their education, to rise up. So I'm a big believer of a dollar in the global economy. And one of the core underpinnings of it are the fact that most of the world's key commodities are priced in dollars. And they're priced in dollars because of great exchanges that operate in the United States that are deep and liquid, and people can buy and sell commodities with good price discovery. So I became very concerned with China's replicating a lot of those key commodity markets in the yuan. And so I became a big advocate for steps to make sure that these US markets remain deep and liquid and well functioning. And when I saw the development of the digital yuan, I saw China doing something very, very interesting. And, and I'm not just a critic, because I'll tip my hat. I mean, there's some really great innovation. And the notion of using most of the world's key patents on blockchain technology have been taken out by China. And the ability to network all transactions in a financial system using a digital currency as basically the operating system is such an extraordinarily powerful idea. Right now, like, for example, we have different exchanges where different commodities are used as collateral, and you can net them on one exchange, but you can't net them on the other. And one of the things China's experimented with, can they use a digital yuan as basically the operating system so that all your commodity transactions, all your borrowing and lending transactions, all of your payment transactions are networkable in one blockchain. I mean, and I can spend more time later talking about it. It's a very powerful idea. So then I started talking to friends at the Fed and others, and I realized the United States was nowhere in looking at a central bank digital currency. So I got together with some colleagues and friends, and we started a foundation, the Digital Dollar Foundation. We started the Digital Dollar Project, all of which are not commercial enterprises, 501c3 charities. Our first goal was to catalyze the Federal Reserve to start looking at central bank digital currency. So in that regard, we feel a little bit like, the proverbial dog that was chasing the school bus hits the brakes and we suddenly got a mouthful of bus, because the Biden administration has recently said that developing a central bank digital currency is urgent for the United States. So after 2 years of advocating, we bit the school bus. We also, though, have called for the private sector. One of our core tenets is money is as much a social construct as it is a government construct. And one of the phrases I use in my book, and I have to admit, I stole it from French Premier George Clemenceau at the end of World War I, looking back on the carnage of World War I, said, war is too important to be left to the generals. So in my book, I say money's too important to be left to the central bankers. And I mean no disrespect to central bankers, but I mean exactly what I said before. We all as private citizens have as much stake in what the money of the future looks like, and we've got to be engaged in that fight for the future of money. And so we launched a digital dollar project secondarily to actually conduct pilot testing of how a central bank digital currency would look like. And so on April 12th, we launched we announced the very first of 9 pilot projects. And this one is to explore a central bank digital currency used for atomic settlement of securities, working with the Depository Trust Clearing Corporation. And I had to miss some of the presentations today because we had our first kickoff meeting with virtually every major Wall Street bank and the Depository Trust to look at how we'll use, perhaps someday, a central bank digital currency to do immediate transaction by transaction settlement of securities, which would free up so much capital, would increase so much efficiency, would increase certainty. So the potential for central bank digital currency, and just to round out the question, it's that kind of use of central bank digital currency that I was worried the United States was falling behind China in doing. And now I think to some degree through the efforts of the Digital Dollar Project, that experimentation is taking place. Last 2 points, and then I'll come to this question, is what we announced on April 12th was the very first experiment with a central bank digital currency in history. But as important as that was, even more important, it was the very first in the world private sector, not central bank led, but private sector led experiment with central bank digital currency, which goes to the very point I'm encouraging all you. We in the private sector should be leading the experimentation of the future of money, not leaving it to government. Question, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I very much agree with your ideas about the importance of privacy around like central bank digital currency and money, but also like some things that you said at the beginning of your talks, and I will also agree to emphasize the importance of blockchain, its usefulness as a bookkeeping tool and so on. So my question here is, where would you draw the appropriate line about, you know, to what things should be associated? So presumably not everybody's direct consumption choices, but presumably as a useful record keeping device, like at least like firms incoming money you would want to have there. And what are your thoughts on that? Because
Yeah, I'm going to respond to that. I'm also going to respond to the second part of his question about DeFi. And what I would say to all of you is, you may be the first economists in history that actually have an opportunity to study markets in their most pure state. If you think about it, what's happening right now is you're seeing the emergence of all these new markets, distributed ledger based, but pure markets without government regulation, right? Without all kinds of mandated structures. It's almost as pure a state of nature as one could ever ask for in terms of market development, right? These entrepreneurs that are building these markets are having crowdsourced approaches to what rules should apply. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, right? And I think it gives you an opportunity to look at something that, say, academics coming out of my generation with that very advanced, well-developed financial system, you know, it'd be interesting to study how clearing is done in all these Western systems. But, you know, the hundreds of years of development and rulemaking, here you've got something that's almost as pure as it can be. And so I think it's an absolute fascinating opportunity. And what I would suggest to you, humbly, is that there are some things, as the professor noted before, he called it the Wild West, and he noted all these, you know, propensities for fraud, manipulation. All of that is actually going to get cleaned up. Those are stuff we've known about. There was a study done in England a couple of years ago about financial crime, and they actually went back 400 years. And they looked at all the major scandals in the market, and they basically said it's the same stuff over and over again, right? And they actually came up, I think, with 20 categories of financial crime, and they could put everything over 400 years into like those 20 categories. So all that stuff's going to be taken care of. What I think is really cool is some of the opportunity for new thinking on market structure, of liquidity building, of execution methodologies that this new industry can attempt to do And they can't do it in mature market because the decisions about how execution is done is already established. It may be first in, it may be batch auctions, already done. Whereas this industry is experimenting with all kinds of legitimate approaches, but that we can't experiment within the legacy system because the decision is already settled. And so I think those type of analysis, because it may tell us things that we could do better in our existing system. So, for example, I followed for years this debate in Washington over high frequency trading that's all based upon the protocol that the first to hit the price gets the trade. And therefore, faster and faster made sense. But nobody addressed the fact that if we change the method of execution to batch auctions, you wouldn't need to get there first anymore, so you wouldn't have to have all this high frequency stuff. But there's no way to experiment with that because that's long settled about how securities transaction. This is a marketplace, it's a green field. And so these innovators are experimenting with things. And I think you have the opportunity as academics to study these different innovations and actually tell us, wow, there's some really good outcomes here. Maybe we can use that in some of our legacy systems.
So we're a little bit over time,
Yeah.
but can we take one last
Sure.
question? Since Sam,
I did. Thank you for that. Simple questions. I want to ask, how do you envision the future role of the traditional commercial banks within this kind of new ecosystem?
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to be in the correspondent banking business these days, right? I think correspondent banks, I've seen some figures that they take 1 or 2% of the world's GDP just to move money around the globe. In the same way that Bell Telephone System and others used to charge people to move communications around the globe, and now communications are virtually free. To me, there's actually no technological reason we can't move money as easily as we move a photograph or a text message. And so correspondent banking system, I think that's threatened by this innovation the same way Kodak and Sears Roebuck were by the first wave of the internet. On the other hand, fractional banking, I think, still needs, people are still going to, if they got 10,000, they still need to borrow 30 to buy a new car. If they've got 100,000, they still need to borrow 300 to buy a house. And people, especially in a rising interest rate market, are going to want to get a return on their money. And even if there's a digital dollar, if it doesn't pay interest, they're going to need to gather interest. In fact, people who actually may put more money in the bank if it's as simple as swiping their mobile device from a digital wallet into a digital bank account. We don't know. It's one of the reasons the Digital Dollar Project believes we need to experiment. It could actually be a boon for fractional banking. I don't think it's a boon for for correspondent banking. But then again, that's just a tax on moving money that I don't think really makes sense in a digital world anymore.
So thank you very much.